They didn't close the docks because they were unsafe. They closed them because the system finally caught up with what had already been built, and by then it was too late to pretend it was legal. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I own a $6 million marina on the edge of Clearwater Bay, a working waterfront facility that handles private vessels, charter operations, and seasonal docking contracts under fully registered county permits that date back over a decade. The morning everything changed started with silence, the kind of silence that feels wrong when you manage active water traffic, because normally there is movement, radios, engines, and dock crews preparing slips before sunrise, but that morning there was none of it when I arrived at the main pier. Instead, I saw the first indication of restriction. Bright County-issued lock devices placed across the southern dock access gates, sealing off entry points that were normally open for scheduled vessel movement. I stepped closer, thinking it might be a temporary inspection hold, but then I noticed something else: printed notices attached to each locked post, referencing an active enforcement order tied to multiple complaint filings submitted by the Homeowners Association located just beyond the marina boundary line. 23 separate complaints, all listed in sequence, each one referencing alleged violations of waterfront usage policy, environmental interference claims, and disputed access rights that I had never been formally served with in any prior county communication. I stood there reading the documents as the tide moved slowly against the dock pylons, watching charter boats anchored just outside the restricted zone, their captains unsure whether they were allowed to approach or had been silently excluded from operations without notice. My operations manager arrived a few minutes later, holding a tablet that displayed conflicting updates from our scheduling system. Half of the slips marked active, the other half suddenly flagged as restricted by external administrative input. That was the moment I realized this was not a maintenance issue or a safety inspection. This was a jurisdictional override attempt initiated through complaint escalation rather than direct regulatory review. Across the waterline, I could already see movement from the neighboring residential association offices, small groups gathering near the shoreline observation deck, watching the marina as if waiting for confirmation that their reports had triggered a response. I contacted the County Maritime Authority immediately, requesting clarification on the enforcement status, and the response I received was cautious, stating that a field verification unit had been deployed in response to multiple overlapping claims regarding waterfront infrastructure compliance. That phrase, overlapping claims, told me everything I needed to know about how quickly this situation had escalated beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. Within the hour, I saw sheriff vehicles approaching the marina access road, followed by a county inspection unit carrying survey equipment and legal documentation folders, signaling that this was no longer a local complaint process, but an active legal review of property and infrastructure boundaries. I walked toward the main office building as they arrived, watching as the first officer stepped out and looked across the entire marina layout, taking in the docks, the mooring lines, and the restricted access points now physically locked by county enforcement hardware. Nothing had been dismantled yet. Nothing had been removed, but the message was already clear. The marina had entered a legal containment phase, and everything I had built here was about to be measured not by operation, but by authority on paper. The sheriff did not speak much when he entered the marina office, but the presence of Sheriff Mason Cross changed the entire atmosphere the moment he stepped onto the dock platform, because everything that had been administrative a few minutes earlier suddenly became procedural enforcement under active review. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood inside the marina operations building watching as county personnel spread out across the waterfront, placing temporary boundary indicators along sections that were now officially under legal verification hold. The deputies who had installed the locks earlier were now joined by a survey supervisor and a county legal liaison, each carrying different parts of the same investigation process: maps, registry extracts, and enforcement authorization forms that would determine whether any part of the marina operations could continue without restriction. I could hear fragments of conversation through the open office window, references to overlapping complaint clusters, zoning interpretations, and waterfront access disputes, all of which were being compared directly against county recorded easements that defined exactly where my marina ended and where any public or HOA influence claims began. Across the waterline, the vessels that normally docked in scheduled rotation were now idling offshore, waiting for clearance that was no longer being controlled by dock staff, but by enforcement protocol. My operations manager stood beside me reviewing system logs that showed partial shutdown flags being applied externally to slip assignments, as if the marina had been digitally partitioned without physical confirmation. That was when I received confirmation that the Homeowners Association president, Rebecca Dalton, had escalated 23 separate complaint filings into a consolidated enforcement request, arguing that the marina expansion encroached on community-managed waterfront space. The language used in the filings was procedural, but the effect it created was operational disruption, because it triggered an automatic review cycle within the County Maritime Authority that required immediate field verification once multiple claims overlapped. Sheriff Cross reviewed the initial documentation with the county liaison and then instructed a full perimeter confirmation sweep, meaning every dock, every mooring line, and every access point would be checked against official registry maps before any further operational decision could be made. I watched as survey equipment was deployed along the main pier, with technicians marking reference points that aligned physical infrastructure with digital property overlays stored in the county system. Nothing about the marina had physically changed yet, but its legal status was being rewritten in real time through verification layers that operated independently of daily business activity. Rebecca Dalton arrived shortly after, accompanied by 2 HOA representatives, and immediately began referencing community development rights and waterfront usage concerns, but she was stopped mid-explanation when the county legal liaison requested that all claims be directed into the active review file rather than verbal presentation. The shift in tone was immediate, because once documentation enters the verification cycle, argument is no longer processed in real time, only recorded for adjudication. I stood near the office entrance watching as Sheriff Cross confirmed that the marina would remain under enforcement observation until all jurisdictional boundaries were fully reconciled, meaning no new docking activity could be authorized regardless of prior scheduling agreements. The boats offshore continued to drift slowly, engines low, as if waiting for a system decision that had already begun internally but had not yet been externally finalized. And in that moment, it became clear that the conflict was no longer about complaints or opinions, but about whether the physical reality of the marina matched the legal reality recorded in county systems, because only one of those could ultimately define what happened next. The first full perimeter verification sweep began just after the county survey supervisor confirmed that the marina layout would need to be mapped in real time against official waterfront registry data. And at that moment, the entire structure of my operations shifted from active business management into a monitored legal environment. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood at the edge of the main dock office watching as Sheriff Mason Cross coordinated movement between inspection teams, each assigned to a different section of the marina, including slips, mooring lanes, fuel access points, and maintenance zones that had all now been placed under enforcement observation. The presence of Rebecca Dalton and her Homeowners Association representatives remained near the shoreline observation deck, but their role had changed from claim initiators to documented participants in an active legal review process, meaning every statement they made was now being recorded rather than acted upon immediately. I could see survey technicians placing reference markers along the outer pier, aligning physical dock structures with digital cadastral overlays being displayed on handheld devices connected directly to the county system. Each alignment check produced incremental confirmations or discrepancies, and those results were being transmitted in real time to the legal liaison who stood beside Sheriff Cross, updating the enforcement log with each verified data point. Across the marina, the vessels that had been scheduled for docking earlier in the day were still waiting offshore, maintaining distance from the restricted perimeter as instructed, their captains communicating through low-frequency radio channels with my operations manager, who was now acting under partial system override conditions. That override did not remove ownership, but it suspended operational autonomy until legal clarity was fully established, which meant no new docking assignments could be processed regardless of prior reservations. I watched as the survey supervisor paused near dock section B, marking a discrepancy between the physical extension of the pier and the recorded boundary line shown in the county registry, and that single observation triggered a secondary review cycle that expanded the inspection zone further into the marina's northern infrastructure. Rebecca Dalton attempted once again to assert that the marina expansion had been previously discussed in community planning meetings, but Sheriff Cross interrupted only to direct her to submit all supporting documentation through the formal case file, reinforcing that verbal claims were no longer part of the active verification stage. The tone of the entire site had shifted into structured evaluation, where every physical asset was being measured against a static legal record rather than evolving interpretations of community intent. I moved slightly closer to the office window as another update came through from the County Maritime Authority confirming that the 23 complaint filings had been consolidated into a single enforcement review case, now designated as a waterfront jurisdiction conflict requiring full boundary resolution before operational status could be restored. That classification effectively placed the marina in a legal holding state, meaning its infrastructure existed physically but not operationally within the county system until final determination. Sheriff Cross then issued a directive to extend the inspection perimeter to include auxiliary docks and service corridors, ensuring that no unregistered access points remained outside verification scope, and I could see additional markers being deployed along secondary walkways as teams moved deeper into the facility. The water itself remained calm, but everything connected to it had become structured, measured, and recorded in ways that removed uncertainty from every physical space it touched. Rebecca stood still near the observation rail, no longer speaking, as if recognizing that the process unfolding in front of her was no longer responsive to advocacy, but entirely governed by documentation integrity. And as the survey data continued to flow into the county system, it became increasingly clear that the outcome would not be decided by complaint volume or operational history, but by whether every inch of constructed waterfront could be reconciled with the legal boundaries that had existed long before any of these disputes had ever been filed. The enforcement status escalation began when the County Maritime Authority issued a secondary classification update, shifting the entire marina case from standard jurisdiction review into what they labeled a full waterfront infrastructure reconciliation protocol. And I remember reading that notification on my operations terminal while standing inside the dock office, realizing that every layer of this situation was now being processed simultaneously by multiple county divisions. My name is Caleb Morgan. And at that point, the marina was no longer being treated as a single operational facility, but as a mapped legal structure composed of individually verified components, each dock, slip, and access corridor being evaluated against historical registry data and current compliance frameworks. Sheriff Mason Cross remained on site, coordinating directly with the survey supervisor and legal liaison, ensuring that every adjustment in the field was immediately reflected in the official case file, which meant that physical movement across the marina was now mirrored by procedural updates in real time. I observed as the inspection teams reached the central maintenance dock, where another discrepancy was identified between the registered boundary line and the physical extension of the platform, prompting an immediate pause in documentation flow as the system recalculated the corrected perimeter definition. Rebecca Dalton had by now moved closer to the main office entrance, her posture noticeably less assertive than earlier, as she attempted to reference additional community planning records that she believed supported the HOA position. But Sheriff Cross responded by instructing that all supplementary claims be submitted through formal evidence intake channels rather than on-site discussion. That instruction effectively ended any remaining informal negotiation, replacing it with structured legal processing where only verified documentation could influence the outcome. I stepped outside briefly to look across the marina basin, where the vessels remained anchored beyond the restricted perimeter line, their presence now functioning as passive observers to a process they could not influence. The water was still, but the administrative activity surrounding it was not, as county units continued marking, measuring, and logging each segment of waterfront infrastructure into the legal system that governed it. The survey supervisor reported a cumulative mapping variance that extended beyond initial estimates, indicating that multiple dock segments had been constructed outside of previously recorded easement zones, and that finding immediately triggered an expansion of the verification boundary deeper into the northern slip area. Sheriff Cross acknowledged the report without delay and authorized continuation of full perimeter assessment, reinforcing that no section of the marina would be exempt from review until full reconciliation was achieved. Inside the office, I could see my operations manager speaking with county technicians who were now integrating marina scheduling systems with enforcement overlays, effectively separating active commercial operations from legally restricted zones in real time. That separation did not eliminate ownership, but it redefined operational capacity under temporary compliance hold conditions, which meant that every function of the marina now required clearance through the verification system before execution. Rebecca finally stepped back from the entrance area, no longer attempting to present arguments, instead observing quietly as the documentation process continued to override every prior assumption of community authority. The legal liaison then confirmed that the consolidated complaint file had been formally escalated into a state-level review request due to the scale of waterfront infrastructure involved, which placed the entire case under extended jurisdictional analysis beyond local county authority alone. That confirmation marked another structural shift in the case, because it extended the timeline of resolution while simultaneously strengthening the procedural foundation of the enforcement action already in place. As the afternoon light reflected across the marina surface, I understood that what was unfolding was not a temporary shutdown or a neighborhood dispute, but a complete system-level audit of how waterfront ownership, infrastructure development, and administrative claims intersect when every layer of authority is forced to align with recorded legal truth. The final phase of verification began when the state-level Maritime Compliance Division formally acknowledged receipt of the escalated case file, and that acknowledgement changed the entire operational context of the marina from a county-managed review into a multi-jurisdiction infrastructure audit that required synchronized validation across county and state databases. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood inside the Marina Operations Office watching as new status flags appeared across our internal management system, indicating that every dock, slip, and service corridor was now under layered compliance review with restricted operational permissions until final legal reconciliation was completed. Sheriff Mason Cross remained on site as the primary enforcement coordinator, working alongside the county legal liaison and survey supervisor to ensure that every physical measurement taken along the waterfront matched the digital registry overlays being processed in real time through the state database connection. The presence of Rebecca Dalton and the Homeowners Association representatives had shifted again, now positioned entirely outside of operational influence, as their submissions were no longer treated as active claims, but as supporting documents within a larger adjudication framework that had already moved beyond local interpretation. I observed through the office window as inspection teams reached the farthest northern docks, where additional structural discrepancies had been identified between constructed extensions and recorded waterfront boundaries, triggering another expansion of the verified inspection zone that now encompassed nearly the entire marina perimeter. Each new finding was immediately transmitted into the case log, where the legal liaison recorded cumulative variance reports that continued to show consistent misalignment between physical infrastructure and authorized easement records. My operations manager informed me that the marina scheduling system had been fully integrated into the enforcement monitoring platform, meaning that every attempted vessel assignment was now automatically cross-checked against compliance status before approval could be granted, effectively separating operational capability from legal authorization in real time. I stepped out toward the central pier area where survey markers had been placed along the main dock structure, and I could see how the physical environment had been transformed into a mapped evidence field, where every structural component now served as a reference point for legal evaluation rather than commercial activity. Sheriff Cross received a final field update confirming that no additional unauthorized extensions were found beyond the northern boundary sweep, but the report also reinforced that multiple existing dock segments required formal classification under correction review due to confirmed easement discrepancies. Rebecca Dalton attempted once more to submit additional community correspondence through the county liaison, but the documents were immediately logged into the evidence intake system without discussion, reinforcing that all communication was now strictly procedural rather than interpretive. The shift in tone across the entire site had become absolute, as every interaction was filtered through documentation integrity rather than verbal assertion, and I realized that this was no longer a conflict being resolved in real time, but a structured legal transition unfolding across multiple administrative layers simultaneously. As the afternoon progressed, state-level reviewers confirmed that the case would remain active under extended jurisdictional monitoring until full reconciliation of all waterfront infrastructure records was achieved, ensuring that no operational restoration could occur until every discrepancy had been resolved through official registry correction. Standing at the edge of the dock, watching the calm water reflect the now silent infrastructure above it, I understood that the marina had entered its final state of legal suspension, where physical reality and recorded authority would continue to be measured against each other until both aligned completely under verified law. The final administrative closure phase began when the State Maritime Compliance Division issued its preliminary reconciliation directive, signaling that all remaining marina infrastructure would now be evaluated under unified federal and county review standards before any operational restoration could be considered. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood alone at the edge of the main dock office as the last layer of enforcement teams prepared to withdraw from active inspection mode, leaving behind a fully documented waterfront system that no longer functioned as a commercial marina, but as a complete legal record of infrastructure under review. Sheriff Mason Cross had already completed his final perimeter confirmation, ensuring that every access point, dock segment, and restricted zone was properly sealed under county enforcement authorization, and his departure marked the transition from field control to administrative processing at the state level. The survey supervisor remained briefly to finalize the last synchronization of physical measurements with digital registry overlays, confirming that all recorded discrepancies had been logged into the official correction database for legal adjudication. Rebecca Dalton and the Homeowners Association representatives were no longer present on site, their involvement reduced entirely to documented submissions within the case file, which was now being handled exclusively through state compliance review channels rather than local interaction. I watched as the marina slowly returned to stillness, not through dismantling or removal, but through the absence of operational authorization that had once allowed vessels, crews, and scheduling systems to function freely across the waterfront. The docks remained intact, but their status had fundamentally changed, each structure now labeled within the county system as conditionally suspended pending legal reconciliation of recorded boundaries and infrastructure classification. My operations manager provided a final system report indicating that all active scheduling functions had been disabled under compliance protocol, ensuring that no further vessel assignments could be processed until full regulatory clearance was achieved. I walked along the central pier where survey markers still stood aligned with the edges of the waterfront structures, and I could see how every physical element of the marina had been converted into a mapped reference point for ongoing legal evaluation. The water itself remained unchanged, moving gently against the pilings, but everything above it had been redefined through documentation, measurement, and recorded authority. Sheriff Cross sent a final confirmation message through the county channel stating that the enforcement phase was officially complete and that all remaining activity would proceed under administrative review until state-level reconciliation was finalized. That message marked the end of physical enforcement presence, but not the end of the process, as the marina now existed within a structured legal framework where every past action, approval, and construction detail would be re-examined against verified registry standards. I stood for a long moment at the edge of the dock, observing the stillness that had replaced what was once constant movement, and I understood that the outcome of this entire situation was no longer dependent on operational control or local dispute resolution, but on whether the recorded legal reality could fully align with the physical infrastructure that had been built over time. As the enforcement vehicles departed the access road and the final county units cleared the perimeter, the marina remained suspended in a state of formal review, where ownership was not in question, but its operational meaning had been permanently redefined until the system completed its final verification cycle. The final reconciliation directive from the State Maritime Compliance Division arrived just after sunrise, and it marked the moment when the entire marina case transitioned from administrative review into full legal closure preparation, meaning every remaining evaluation would now be conducted entirely through documented record analysis rather than any form of field activity. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood at the edge of the now silent waterfront as the last procedural updates were finalized across county and state systems, confirming that all infrastructure on my $6 million marina had been fully cataloged, verified, and placed under permanent legal classification pending final registry alignment. Sheriff Mason Cross had already completed his final report submission, officially closing the enforcement phase and confirming that no further physical intervention would occur unless new legal discrepancies were discovered during the state-level audit process. The survey supervisor's final dataset had been integrated into the county archive system, ensuring that every dock, slip, and access corridor was now permanently tied to its corresponding legal boundary record, eliminating any remaining ambiguity regarding waterfront jurisdiction. Rebecca Dalton and the Homeowners Association representatives had been fully removed from active proceedings, their involvement now restricted to historical documentation within the case file, which had been transferred to the State Maritime Compliance Board for final adjudication review. I walked slowly along the main pier, observing how the marina had entered a state of operational suspension that no longer felt temporary, because every functional system had been disabled at the administrative level rather than the physical one, leaving the structures intact but without authorization to operate. The water moved gently beneath the docks, reflecting the stillness of a facility that had once been fully active but was now defined entirely by compliance status codes and legal classification markers embedded within the county registry. My operations manager handed me the final system summary, confirming that all scheduling functions, docking assignments, and fuel access permissions had been permanently suspended pending completion of state reconciliation procedures, effectively separating ownership from operational capability until legal resolution was finalized. I stood at the central dock where survey markers still aligned with the edges of the marina infrastructure, and I could see how every physical element had been converted into a mapped reference point for ongoing legal review, transforming the entire waterfront into a structured dataset of recorded reality. Sheriff Cross sent a final communication confirming that the enforcement authority had been fully withdrawn and that all remaining oversight would be handled exclusively through administrative channels, signaling the complete end of field jurisdiction over the property. That message confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was no longer a dispute being managed in real time, but a completed enforcement cycle transitioning into formal legal closure at the state level. As I looked across the marina basin, I saw no movement from vessels or crews, only the static presence of infrastructure now defined by documentation rather than activity, and I realized that the system had fully separated physical ownership from operational identity until every recorded boundary, approval, and historical claim could be reconciled under unified legal authority. When the last county vehicle disappeared from the access road and the final enforcement markers were logged into the state archive, the marina remained exactly where it had always been, but its meaning had been permanently rewritten into the official record, where only verified truth would determine what it was allowed to become next. The final state reconciliation review began when the Maritime Compliance Board issued its formal closure directive, signaling that the marina case had moved from active administrative processing into final archival verification, where every recorded detail would be locked into permanent legal status within both county and state registry systems. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood alone at the edge of the marina operations zone, now completely silent, as I reviewed the last official transmission confirming that all infrastructure across my $6 million waterfront facility had been fully documented, classified, and submitted for permanent compliance indexing. Sheriff Mason Cross had already departed the jurisdiction after delivering his final enforcement summary, which confirmed that all physical verification procedures had been completed and that no further field intervention would be authorized unless future discrepancies were identified during post-review auditing. The survey supervisor's compiled dataset had been finalized and transferred into the State Maritime Archive, ensuring that every dock, slip, pier extension, and access corridor now existed as a legally defined coordinate within the official waterfront registry, eliminating any remaining ambiguity between physical construction and recorded authorization. Rebecca Dalton and the Homeowners Association representatives were no longer present in any operational capacity, their involvement fully reduced to documented filings preserved within the case archive, which had now become part of the state-level adjudication record awaiting final procedural closure confirmation. I walked slowly along the central dock, observing how the marina had transitioned into a static legal environment where physical structures remained intact, but their functional identity had been entirely replaced by classification status entries embedded in the compliance system. The water beneath the pier continued to move with natural rhythm, but everything above it had been transformed into a mapped representation of regulated infrastructure, each segment assigned a compliance designation reflecting its verified or disputed status within the legal framework. My operations manager delivered the final system output confirming that all operational permissions had been permanently suspended under state directive, meaning no scheduling, docking, or service activity could resume until the entire reconciliation process was formally concluded and approved at the highest regulatory level. I stood near the main administrative building where survey markers still aligned with the outer perimeter of the marina, and I could see how the entire facility had been converted into a structured evidentiary field, where every physical element functioned as a reference point for legal verification rather than commercial use. The final communication from the State Compliance Board confirmed that the marina would remain in legal suspension status until all registry corrections were fully validated and certified, ensuring that no operational authority could be reinstated without complete alignment between recorded ownership boundaries and physical infrastructure mapping. Sheriff Cross's final notation in the enforcement record stated that jurisdictional control had been fully relinquished to administrative review channels, marking the end of any active field authority over the property and transferring all remaining responsibility to procedural legal resolution. As I looked across the still waterfront, where no vessels were moving and no crews were operating, I understood that the marina had entered its final phase of existence under the law, where its physical presence no longer defined its function, and only its recorded classification within the system would determine what it was permitted to become once the legal process reached its conclusion. The final legal closure notification arrived on a quiet morning when the marina no longer felt like a disputed site, but like a fully documented and archived waterfront system waiting for permanent registry confirmation. And that message marked the moment when everything that had happened across the past weeks was officially transitioned from active enforcement into final legal resolution status. My name is Caleb Morgan, and I stood alone at the central pier of my $6 million marina, reading the State Maritime Compliance Board's final determination notice that confirmed all infrastructure on the property had been fully reconciled against county and state registry records, completing the last stage of legal verification required for case closure. There were no sheriff vehicles on site anymore, no survey teams, and no enforcement units. Only the remaining physical marina structures that now existed purely as legally classified assets within the official system. Sheriff Mason Cross had submitted his final jurisdictional release statement 2 days earlier, confirming that all field authority had been formally withdrawn and that the marina case had been transferred entirely into administrative archives for permanent record settlement. The survey supervisor's final correction report had already been validated and sealed into the state database, meaning every dock, pier extension, and access channel had been permanently assigned its verified legal boundary status, removing any remaining ambiguity between physical construction and recorded ownership rights. Rebecca Dalton and the Homeowners Association representatives were now officially listed only within the procedural history file, their 23 complaint filings preserved as part of the documented escalation chain that triggered the initial enforcement review but no longer held any operational influence over the outcome. I walked slowly along the main dock where survey markers had once been actively used during inspection, now left as static reference points until county crews returned to remove temporary field equipment, and I could feel the complete absence of administrative movement across the entire waterfront. The water beneath the marina reflected the stillness of a system that had finished processing itself, no longer reacting, no longer adjusting, only existing in a finalized state defined by completed legal reconciliation. My operations manager arrived with the last system report showing that all compliance flags had been cleared and that operational access could be restored under normal conditions, though the marina would remain under periodic audit status to ensure long-term registry alignment remained consistent with the final ruling. I stood at the edge of the central pier looking across the full span of the marina, realizing that every structure that had once been part of an active dispute was now simply part of a resolved record, its meaning no longer shaped by conflict, but by documentation. The final state communication from the Maritime Compliance Board confirmed that the case was officially closed, with all legal findings entered into permanent archive status, marking the end of all review cycles, enforcement phases, and jurisdictional transfers related to the property. Sheriff Cross's concluding notation summarized the entire process as a completed infrastructure reconciliation event, where physical waterfront development and recorded ownership boundaries had been fully aligned under verified legal authority. As I looked across the marina for the last time in that administrative context, I understood that nothing had been taken away or added in the end, but everything had been redefined through process, where the system had finally corrected itself to reflect what the land and water boundaries had always been in official record, bringing the entire sequence of conflict, verification, and resolution to its final and permanent conclusion.